the great communicator, lover of Jelly Belly jelly beans, a former Hollywood actor, the oldest man to be elected president. Who could this outstanding individual quite possibly be? My hero, Mr. Ronald Wilson Reagan. Today I'm going to inform you on the life of Ronald Reagan. We will discuss his childhood and years leading up to his life in the White House, his presidency, and last but certainly not least, his living legacy. According to www.reaganfoundation.org, Ronald Wilson Reagan was born on February 6, 1911 to Nell and John Reagan in Tampico, Illinois. He weighed 10 pounds and joined his 2-year-old brother Neil at home. Throughout his childhood, the Reagan family moved a total of 7 times. Finally, they ended up in Dixon, Illinois, where Ronald attended Dixon High School. There he gained his love for performing in various acts as he was president of the Dramatic Club. He was also captain of the football team, art director of the yearbook, and student body president of Dixon High School in his senior year. In his free time, Ronald worked as a lifeguard at Lowell Park. He graduated from high school in 1928. After high school, Ronald Reagan attended Eureka College, where he majored in economics. During college, he became more and more interested in drama, aspiring to be a Hollywood actor. After graduating in 1932, Reagan got a job in radio broadcasting. A few years later, his job brought him up to California to broadcast the Chicago Cubs spring training. Year after year, Reagan traveled out west with the Cubs until he was finally recognized by an agent and offered a contract with Warner Bros. He accepted, and his dreams of being an actor had finally been fulfilled. While filming the movie Brother Rat, Reagan met Jane Wyman. They later married and had Maureen and Michael. Reagan's acting career was put to a halt when he was called to active duty after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After the war, he returned to Hollywood and continued making movies, but his main focus was politics. In 1949, Reagan divorced his wife and started campaigning more and more for the Democratic Party. 3 years later, he met and married Nancy Davis. Together they had Patricia and Ronald Prescott. It wasn't until 1962 that Ronald Reagan officially changed his party registration to Republican. After making several televised speeches, supporters of Reagan convinced him to run for California governor. He was elected on November 8, 1966, and served for 2 terms. Throughout the Carter administration, Reagan became more and more concerned about what was happening in Washington, D.C. That's when he decided to run for president of the United States of America. With George Bush on his side, Reagan was ready to defeat Jimmy Carter, and he did just that. On November 4, 1980, Mr. Ronald Wilson Reagan was elected 40th President of the United States. The following January, Reagan took the oath of office and inherited a nation in crisis, as stated by www.whitehouse.gov. With a struggling economy, soon after the inauguration, Reagan implemented a plan that called for a cut in taxes and control of government spending. It was difficult to convince Congress, but the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 was signed into law, and the Reagan recovery had begun. But on March 30th, 1981, after a speech to the Construction Trades Council, President Reagan was shot while getting into his limousine. Fortunately, Jerry Parr, head of the Secret Service, threw his body over the president to protect him. However, the bullet ricocheted off the door of the presidential limousine and punctured the president in the lung. Reagan's response? "Honey, I forgot to duck." After a full recovery, Reagan headed back to work and appointed Sandra Day O'Connor the first female Supreme Court Justice. This would be the first of 3 appointments to the Supreme Court during his presidency. Later to be nominated were William Rehnquist and Anthony Kennedy. Throughout his presidency, Reagan worked hand in hand with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher on both domestic affairs and foreign policy. Reagan and Bush were elected to a second term in 1984. During this term, Reagan came to agreement with the Soviets, ending the Cold War. The Tax Reform Bill of 1986 was signed, as well as the Economic Bill of Rights in July of 1987. And funding was increased for drug education, treatment, and prevention. Reagan, who was 73 years old at the beginning of his second term, faced a few health issues in his last few years of presidency. But his term as the 40th President of the United States ended on a good note, as he watched his former Vice President, George H.W. Bush, be sworn in as the President of the United States. Ronald and Nancy then returned to their home in Bel Air, California. After his presidency, Reagan wrote his autobiography and continued to support the Republican Party. He received several awards, including the Grand Cordon of the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum, the highest possible award given by the Japanese, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and being inducted into the Academy of Moral and Political Science, just to name a few. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was also dedicated to him. But in November of 1994, things took a sharp turn for the former president when he publicly announced that he had Alzheimer's disease. He was aware of his condition and lived his life with courage and optimism, always trusting in the Lord. On June 5, 2004, Ronald Reagan passed away at his home in Bel Air with his wife Nancy by his side. Just 6 days later, his funeral services were held at the nation's capital, and the world said goodbye to the Gipper. Today I informed you on the life of Ronald Reagan. We discussed his childhood and years leading up to his presidency. We discussed his life in the White House, as well as his living legacy. As stated in an article in the Huffington Post, Ronald Reagan really loved his country. He fought hard and stood up for everything he believed in. He shaped America into a model country. And for that, I salute him and feel honored to call him the greatest president of the 20th century. Thank you.